Imagine being the boss of a company so powerful. You think you've seen it all. But what if, one ordinary day, you walk into your own movie theater and overhear a conversation that completely stops you in your tracks? Two girls, unaware of who you are talking about how they've been turned away at the ticket counter, just because they didn't look rich enough. What happens next will shock you. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Mark Anderson stood in line at the ticket counter, his usual impatience bubbling up as the minutes ticked by. As CEO of the large transport company, he was used to managing everything from board meetings to investor relations. But today, his attention was elsewhere. In front of him, two women were deep in conversation, voices raised just enough for Mark to overhear. "I don't understand. We were told the price was higher because we just didn't look the part." One woman complained, her tone laced with frustration. "They said we didn't look elegant enough to get the discount." The other woman nodded, clearly agreeing, her arms folded tight across her chest. "This is insane. I mean, who judges someone's worth based on their appearance?" Mark's ears perked up. That caught his attention. What he overheard wasn't just a simple complaint. It was a red flag. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, now more focused on the conversation than the slow-moving line. His mind raced. As he glanced around the crowded ticket area, he noticed something unsettling. Several customers, older men, young families, even business travelers, seemed to be expressing similar concerns. "I can't believe it. They just told me I don't fit the profile for a discount." Another man muttered angrily to his companion. Another woman, a mother with two young children, looked particularly upset as she walked away from the counter with a receipt in hand. Shaking her head, Mark stood there, his heart pounding. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. This was no coincidence. Something was very wrong, and he needed to know what. It wasn't just a few disgruntled customers, it was a pattern. And it wasn't a small issue. It was potentially a big one. His company's policies were being called into question. And more importantly, the integrity of the service was at stake. At first, Mark wasn't sure what to make of it all. It seemed so out of character for the company he had built. His company prided itself on service excellence and customer satisfaction, values he had nurtured since the very beginning. But now, he was forced to face the uncomfortable possibility that something had gone terribly wrong beneath the surface. As he made his way to the counter, Mark couldn't help but wonder, was this something more than a misunderstanding? Or was there a deeper, darker issue at play? He hesitated for a moment, looking at the ticket counter again, his mind whirring. Should he just drop it and move on? Let it go as a fluke? Or should he dig deeper and find out the truth, no matter where it led? His gut told him not to ignore it. He had to find out what was really happening, even if it meant uncovering something much larger than he ever imagined. Mark sat at his desk, a quiet storm brewing inside him. After overhearing the complaints at the ticket counter, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play. His company, which he had built from the ground up, was now being implicated in something that went against everything it stood for. He needed answers, and he knew where to start. It was time to confront the people in charge. The first on his list was Paul, a senior manager responsible for the company's ticketing policies. Mark had known Paul for years, but something about his behavior lately felt off. Mark had always trusted him, but now, his gut told him that trust might have been misplaced. There were too many questions surrounding the issue, and Paul's reaction to the inquiries had been less than reassuring. Mark set up a meeting with Paul, determined to get to the bottom of it. He arrived at Paul's office, trying to maintain a calm exterior despite the turmoil inside. When Paul opened the door, he gave Mark a tight, almost forced smile. "Mark, good to see you. What's on your mind?" Paul asked, his tone friendly but distant. "I've been hearing some complaints from customers." Mark began, his voice steady. "There are reports of ticket pricing being refused based on appearance. What can you tell me about that?" Paul stiffened slightly, his gaze avoiding Mark's for a moment before he finally met it again. "Well, you know how things can get. People misinterpret policies all the time. It's nothing to worry about. Really? Mark leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. It's not just a few isolated cases. Paul, more and more customers are being turned away. And it's not just about the tickets. It's the principle of the thing. We're a company that prides itself on fairness. Paul's smile faltered, and his unease was now more obvious. He shifted in his chair, tapping his fingers nervously on the desk. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. I'll have a word with the team. Nothing to be concerned about. Really. But Mark wasn't convinced. There was something off about the way Paul was dodging the issue. It wasn't like him to be so evasive. This was more than just an oversight. Something larger was happening behind the scenes. And Mark could feel it. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Mark began reaching out to others, more employees and customers. The more he dug, the more he started to see a pattern. Some were afraid to speak out, worried about their jobs, while others seemed unaware of the full scope of the issue. But the fragments of information he gathered pointed to something far more insidious than just a series of isolated incidents. One afternoon, as Mark reviewed a stack of internal reports, his eyes caught a document that made his blood run cold. It was a memo discussing ticketing policies, with a long list of guidelines on customer appearance and eligibility for discounts. At first, Mark thought it was a mistake, but the deeper he read, the more it became clear, this wasn't an accident. It was a calculated decision. And worse still, the memo was signed off by none other than Paul. Mark felt a chill creep up his spine. This wasn't just poor judgment, it was a deliberate, systemic issue. The company he had worked so hard to build was now at the mercy of a group of people using power and privilege to manipulate customers in, ultimately, his business. But the question remained. Who else was involved? The following day, as Mark pressed forward with his investigation, he discovered that the memo was no longer in the system. It had been erased, wiped clean as if it had never existed. But the most troubling part was that one of Paul's team members, someone who had been crucial in the handling of the ticketing process, had suddenly disappeared. It didn't take long for Mark to realize what this meant. Whoever had been involved in this scheme was trying to cover their tracks, removing evidence, eliminating witnesses, and ensuring that no one would find out the truth. Mark's suspicion was confirmed. This wasn't a case of a single bad decision, but rather a well-organized effort to exploit the company's systems for personal gain. With a deep breath, Mark stared at the screen, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Should he push forward and confront Paul directly about what he had uncovered, risking everything in the process? Or should he let it go and attempt to contain the damage before it spread any further? Mark knew that to do nothing wasn't an option. If he walked away now, it would only get worse. But taking action would expose not only Paul but a larger system of manipulation that could cost him more than just his job. It could destroy the company itself. The decision was clear, though it wasn't an easy one. Mark had to follow the trail, no matter where it led. This was no longer just about ticket prices, it was about justice, integrity, and the future of everything he had worked so hard to build. Mark sat in his office, the documents scattered across his desk a stark contrast to the neatly organized files he was used to. His mind was racing as he processed the information he had already uncovered. This wasn't just an issue of ticket prices or customer complaints. This was something deeper, something systemic. Mark had always trusted his team. But now, after hearing the complaints and discovering the internal memo, he wasn't sure who he could trust. He knew he had to dig deeper. He needed answers. So, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He began using a series of covert tactics to uncover more details. Posing as an interested customer, he visited different ticket counters, attempting to gauge how widespread the issue was. At every location, he received the same response. Customers were being unfairly rejected for discounted tickets based on arbitrary, subjective criteria. It was frustrating. He was gathering pieces of the puzzle, but the full picture still eluded him. One evening, while reviewing the company's internal systems for any records of policy changes, Mark found something that made his heart skip a beat. Buried in an obscure file was a confidential memo detailing an internal meeting, one that had never been made public. The memo outlined how the company was targeting specific customer groups to charge them higher fees based on factors like appearance, race, and socioeconomic status. Mark couldn't believe what he was reading. It was worse than he imagined. Not only was there a clear pattern of discrimination, but it seemed to be part of a larger strategy designed to boost profits by exploiting these divisions. It was clear now. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was an orchestrated effort, deeply embedded in the company's operations. The thought of how many people were affected made Mark feel sick. How could something so unethical happen under his watch? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mark sought out Rachel, a former employee who had worked closely with Paul's team. Rachel had been transferred out of the company shortly after voicing concerns about the discriminatory policies. Mark had heard rumors about her sudden departure, but now he saw an opportunity to get the full story. He arranged a discreet meeting with her at a coffee shop, away from the prying eyes of the office. "Rachel, thank you for meeting me," Mark said as he slid into the booth across from her. Her face was tense, guarded, but she seemed eager to talk. "I had a feeling you'd come around sooner or later," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder. "You're not the first person to question it, but I'm not sure how much help I can be. They made sure I couldn't keep anything when I left." Mark nodded, leaning in. "Anything you can share would help. I've found some documents, but I need confirmation. I need to know how deep this goes." Rachel hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to the door once more. Finally, she spoke in a low voice. "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but Paul has been behind this for a while. He's been working with others in the company to set up this system. It wasn't just about selling tickets. It's about creating a divide, keeping the right kind of customers paying premium, while the others get pushed aside." Mark's heart sank as Rachel's words sank in. This wasn't just about money, it was about creating an entire system of exclusion. He needed to see the documents she was talking about, to verify what he had already found. "Can you get me anything? Anything at all?" he asked, feeling a sense of urgency now. Rachel nodded, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "I'll help you, Mark, but be careful. Paul's not the only one involved. There are others. You don't know who's on his side." Before Mark could respond, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number read, "You need to stop. You don't know what you're getting into." Mark's stomach churned. Was this a warning? Or had someone from within his company caught wind of his investigation? His heart raced as he looked at Rachel. "We need to move quickly," he said. "I don't trust anyone now. We're in deep, and I don't know who else is watching." As he left the coffee shop, Mark felt the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. He was walking a fine line now. The information Rachel had promised could bring everything to light, but it also made him a target. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous things would become. The next day, Mark received a call from his assistant. "Mark, we've got a problem. One of Paul's team members, Carlos, has gone missing. His last known location was near the office. But now, no one can reach him." Mark's pulse quickened. Carlos was a lower-level employee who had worked closely with Paul on the ticketing systems. Mark had met him once or twice but had never thought much of him. Now, his disappearance felt more like a direct threat. Was Carlos involved in something deeper? Or had someone in the company silenced him? This was no longer just about uncovering a corporate scandal. People's lives were being affected, destroyed, and Mark was at the center of it all, struggling to maintain control while trying to expose the truth. The stakes were higher than ever. Mark's mind raced as he sifted through more and more files, trying to piece together the puzzle that was quickly growing larger and more complex. What started as an isolated incident had now turned into something far more sinister. Every document he uncovered pointed to a systematic pattern, something that seemed too coordinated to be a mere error. The company wasn't just making bad decisions, it was actively manipulating customers for profit. This wasn't just a few bad actors, it was a network of people in power, all playing their part to exploit vulnerable individuals. With the realization sinking in, Mark knew he had to push further. He couldn't just sit behind his desk any longer. He had to see for himself, talk to people, and follow the trail wherever it led. He made plans to visit a branch office in another part of the city. His instincts told him that if this policy was being enforced in one place, it could very well be happening everywhere. Arriving at the branch, Mark was greeted by a cold, sterile environment. The employees seemed detached, barely acknowledging his presence as they went about their business. It wasn't long before Mark approached one of the ticket agents who had been working there for years. He casually started a conversation, asking about the policies, but the conversation quickly turned into a confessional. Is there any truth to what I've been hearing about ticket policies being based on appearance? Mark asked, keeping his tone neutral, pretending to be just another curious customer. The employee's face paled, and for a moment, Mark saw a flicker of hesitation before the man leaned in closer. You don't want to know, the agent whispered, looking over his shoulder nervously. It's been going on for years. We've had our orders. If you look the part, you get the discount. If not, tough luck. Mark's stomach dropped. This wasn't just an isolated case of employees making decisions based on personal biases. It was a carefully orchestrated strategy. He felt a lump form in his throat as he realized the depth of the manipulation. The policy had been in place for years, affecting thousands of customers who had no idea they were being exploited. It wasn't just bad business practice, it was a violation of trust on a massive scale. As Mark continued his investigation, he met with a few other employees, some more forthcoming than others. Most were afraid to talk, worried about their jobs or worse, the potential consequences of crossing the powerful people behind the scheme. However, one woman, an office manager named Linda, seemed determined to help. She had seen the impact of these policies firsthand and was ready to speak out. I don't want to lose my job, she said, after making sure the door was locked and the blinds were drawn. But someone needs to say it out loud. I've been trying to warn people for years. Paul and his crew, they've been running this show for too long. It's not just about ticket sales. It's about control, about keeping the right people in the right seats and making sure they never question the system. Her words hit Mark like a ton of bricks. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't just uncovering a business malpractice, he was exposing an entire system of manipulation. A system that had been running smoothly for far too long. But how deep did it go? Was Paul really the mastermind behind all of this? Or was he just a pawn in a bigger game? Suddenly, Linda's voice grew quieter, and her eyes darted nervously to the door. You need to be careful, Mark. You're not the first person to try and dig into this. People have lost their jobs. Some. They've disappeared. I'm telling you this because you need to understand how far this goes. Before Mark could respond, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Rachel, the former employee who had been helping him with his investigation. There's someone who wants to talk to you. They have something you need. But they're scared. I've been trying to get them to meet with you. But they're hesitant. This is bigger than we thought. Paul's not the only one pulling the strings. Mark felt his heart race. A new lead, a potential witness, but they were scared. Terrified, even. The danger was growing. And now, it seemed like more people than he had ever imagined were involved. Mark knew the stakes were higher than ever. If he couldn't get the evidence he needed before the people behind this covered their tracks even further, everything he had worked for could come crashing down. He stood up, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. The decision was clear. He had to meet this new witness, even if it meant putting himself in harm's way. But he needed to be careful. Every step he took could lead him closer to the truth, but also deeper into a web of lies and corruption. As Mark walked out of the office building, his mind was clouded with uncertainty. How far would he be willing to go to expose the truth? And more importantly, could he outsmart the people who had orchestrated this scheme for so long? The clock was ticking, and Mark knew he had little time to act before the whole system crumbled around him. Mark had been preparing for this moment for days, but now that he was sitting in the conference room across from Paul, he realized nothing could truly prepare him for what he was about to hear. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the weight of the truth that Mark was determined to uncover. The polished wood of the conference table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. But it did nothing to ease the tension. Mark knew this wasn't just a meeting, it was a showdown. A critical point in the battle for the company's future. Paul sat across from him, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a quiet, almost cold assurance. He was prepared. Mark could tell that much. As the silence stretched between them, Mark spoke first, his voice calm but firm. I know what's been going on, Paul. I know about the discriminatory pricing policies. It's not just a few isolated incidents, it's systematic. It's happening across the board. Paul didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. Mark, I understand your concerns, but what you're missing is the bigger picture. This is a strategy for sustainable growth. It's a way to ensure that we're not just catering to the masses, but to the right clientele. Those who can afford it. Those who deserve it. Mark's blood ran cold. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so unapologetically, was jarring. Paul's words weren't just dismissing the issue, they were justifying it. Mark felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. How could Paul, someone he had once trusted, stand by something so fundamentally wrong? You're telling me, Mark replied, his voice now laced with anger, that we're pricing people out based on their appearance? That we're deciding who gets the discount and who doesn't because of some arbitrary standard? That's not a strategy, Paul. That's exploitation. Paul raised an eyebrow, as though Mark's outrage was beneath him. It's a strategy that works. Mark, you've seen the numbers. We're increasing our profits. Why would you want to jeopardize that? Mark's mind was racing, his pulse quickening. He had always prided himself on running a company with integrity. A company that valued fairness and customer satisfaction above all else. But now, it seemed those values were being twisted into a justification for something far darker. I'm not interested in your numbers, Paul. I'm interested in what's right. Mark shot back, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. This isn't just about profits. This is about ethics, about doing what's right, not just what's convenient. Paul's expression hardened. I'm warning you, Mark. If you keep digging into this, you're going to destroy the company. You're going to ruin everything we've built here. You think the investors will stand by you when they realize you've put the company's reputation at risk? Mark felt the full weight of Paul's words. The threat was clear. If he continued down this path, if he exposed the truth, the damage could be catastrophic, not just for the company, but for his career, for everything he had worked for. It was a crossroads, and the decision was weighing heavily on him. He could keep fighting, keep pushing to expose the corruption, or he could back down, walk away, and pretend he had never seen it. But Mark knew deep down that he couldn't walk away. Not now. He had to do what was right, even if it meant losing everything. As he sat there, the weight of the moment pressing on him, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was one of Paul's team members, someone Mark had only met in passing. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands shaking. Mark, I need to talk to you. It's about the documents. There's been a mistake. Part of the evidence, it's gone. It's been erased. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The twist came so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that for a moment, he couldn't process it. He had known there were risks in this battle, but he hadn't anticipated this. Someone on Paul's team, someone close to the heart of the operation, had taken steps to hide the truth. The very evidence he had been relying on to expose the wrongdoing had been destroyed. What do you mean it's gone? Mark demanded, his voice tight with frustration. The files. Some of the critical documents you were looking at, they've been wiped from the system. She explained, her voice barely above a whisper. And I think Paul knew what we were doing. I think he's been covering his tracks for longer than you realize. Mark stood up, his mind spinning. This was bigger than he had thought. Paul wasn't just trying to protect his position, he was willing to go to extreme lengths to maintain control. This wasn't about running a company anymore. It was about power, manipulation, and a fight to hold onto that power at all costs. As he faced Paul again, the weight of the decision pressing on him harder than ever, Mark realized just how deep the corruption ran. His fight for justice had become a battle not just for his company, but for the future of everyone who had been harmed by these policies. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on him as the reality of the situation hit him. He was in this alone. There was no turning back. The only question left was whether or not he had the strength to face what was coming next. The sense of urgency weighed heavily on Mark as he sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of documents and unanswered questions. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting with each passing hour. Paul and his team had already taken significant steps to cover their tracks. And Mark knew if he didn't act quickly, The truth would slip further out of his reach. The thought of all the innocent people who had been affected by this systematic exploitation spurred him into action. Mark immediately reached out to Rachel, hoping she could help him gather the evidence he needed to expose Paul's operation. He also contacted several other former employees who had witnessed the shady dealings but had been too afraid to speak up. He knew it was a risky move, but Mark had no choice. If he was going to uncover the full extent of the corruption, he needed help from those who had seen it firsthand. As Mark and his team worked late into the night, they began infiltrating the company's secure document storage system. They dug through internal files, sifting through financial records, transaction logs, and meeting notes. Their efforts were methodical and cautious. But the deeper they went, the more they found. The first few documents were inconclusive, just standard operating procedures and routine communications, but then Mark stumbled upon something that caught his attention. It was a memorandum from one of the company's most important financial meetings. And it detailed a series of policies and transactions that raised immediate red flags. The policies outlined how certain customers were being segregated for higher pricing based on demographic profiles, essentially carving up the market into groups that could be charged more based on superficial factors like appearance, race, and income. The document was explosive, showing not only the discriminatory pricing but also how Paul and his team had been actively manipulating the company's financial reports to make it seem as if this exploitation was justified. Mark sat back in his chair, stunned. He had hoped to find something. But this was exactly what he needed. It was the smoking gun. The evidence was clear, and it could bring Paul and his entire operation down. He knew he had to act quickly, before Paul or anyone else had a chance to destroy the evidence or cover it up. Just as he was about to call Rachel to share the good news, the phone rang. It was one of his trusted team members. "Mark, you need to get down here right now. We've hit a problem." The voice on the other end of the line said, urgency clear in their tone. Mark rushed to the office where his team had been working. When he walked in, the atmosphere was tense, thick with frustration. His colleague, Sarah, was standing near the computer, her face pale. "What's going on?" Mark asked, anxiety creeping into his voice. "It's gone," Sarah said, shaking her head. "The document we found, part of it has been erased. It's been tampered with. Someone knew we were getting too close." Mark's heart sank. The document he had just uncovered, the key piece of evidence that could expose Paul's manipulation, had been altered. Someone had wiped out the parts that showed the clear manipulation of pricing and the coordinated effort to deceive customers. It was like someone had been watching them, waiting for them to find the truth, and then took swift action to cover it up. But it didn't end there. As Mark scanned the room, he noticed that one of his team members, Michael, was missing. Michael had been working closely with Sarah to retrieve the documents. Mark immediately called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. A sense of dread settled in his stomach. It was clear now. Paul wasn't just protecting himself, he was using every weapon at his disposal to maintain control. And that included silencing anyone who got too close to the truth. Mark paced the room, trying to piece together his next move. He had been careful, but it was becoming evident that the stakes were much higher than he initially realized. If Paul knew about the investigation, then he was using his power to not only cover up the truth but also manipulate the people around him, forcing them into silence or complicity. Mark could feel the pressure mounting from all sides. His own team was starting to fracture, and Paul's hold on the situation seemed stronger than ever. As if on cue, the phone rang again. This time, it was Rachel. "Mark, I'm worried. They're on to us. I'm getting too many strange calls. And I think someone's been watching me. I need to back out. I can't do this anymore." Mark felt a pang of frustration and helplessness. He had no idea how much further Paul's influence reached, but it was clear that it was stretching far and wide. "Don't back out, Rachel," Mark urged, his voice pleading. "We're so close. If we can just get one more piece of evidence, we can bring him down. But we need to stick together. Don't let him win." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Rachel spoke again. "I don't know if I can help anymore. I'm scared, Mark. I don't want to get caught in the crossfire." Mark knew Rachel was right to be scared. They were all in danger now. And it wasn't just about finding evidence anymore, it was about survival. Paul wasn't just a businessman, he was a master manipulator. And Mark was up against a force that was far more powerful than he had anticipated. The room seemed to close in on Mark as he weighed his options. He couldn't let this go, not now. He had come too far. And too many people had been hurt by Paul's greed. But the situation was becoming more dangerous with every passing hour. Mark had to find a way to outsmart Paul, to turn the tables before it was too late. But with the evidence compromised and his team starting to fall apart, Mark knew that the real battle was just beginning. The next move had to be calculated and precise. He had to strike while he still had the upper hand. But the question was, how? Mark leaned over his desk, the weight of the situation heavy in his chest. He had spent days, even weeks, gathering information, finding allies, and preparing for the ultimate confrontation. Now, the time had come to take action. Paul and his team had underestimated him, thinking they could bury the truth. But Mark wasn't going to let that happen. He had a plan, one that would not only expose the corrupt system Paul had built but also bring him and his supporters to justice. Mark gathered the remaining allies he could trust, a few loyal employees, Rachel, and a handful of journalists who had been following the story from the outside. They all understood what was at stake. This wasn't just a corporate battle, it was a fight for integrity, for justice, and for the future of the company. They had all seen the damage Paul had done, and now it was time to make the truth public. They organized a secret meeting, one that would involve key witnesses and experts who could verify the documents Mark had uncovered. It was a tight-knit group, with a carefully laid out plan to make sure the information was delivered in a way that couldn't be ignored. The stakes were high, and the pressure was building, but Mark felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally taking control of the situation. The plan was simple but daring. They would release the evidence to the press at a scheduled press conference. Using the media as a powerful ally, journalists would be there to cover the event, and the key witnesses would testify about the manipulation, the exploitation, and the corruption that had infected the company. Mark knew that once the public knew the truth, there would be no turning back. As the days passed and the press conference drew closer, the tension in the air became palpable. Mark and his team spent long hours preparing, ensuring every detail was perfect. They carefully crafted a narrative, one that would make it clear that this wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was about exposing the system of lies and manipulation that Paul had built. But just as Mark was finalizing the details, a betrayal hit him like a sucker punch. It was Rachel who delivered the news, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Mark, I don't know how to say this, but you need to know. It's C4. They've turned against us." Mark froze, his mind racing. He had trusted C4, a key member of his team who had been instrumental in gathering information. Now, the truth hit him with devastating clarity. C4 had been working for Paul the whole time. They've been feeding him information. Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul must have gotten to them. C4's not on our side anymore. They've been forced to switch sides. Mark's stomach churned. This was the worst possible news he could have received. C4 had been a trusted ally, someone who had seen the evidence firsthand and had agreed to help. Now, everything was at risk. The carefully laid out plan, the press conference, the witnesses, it all depended on their trust in each other. And now that trust was shattered. Mark stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it. How could C4 have turned on them? Was this all part of Paul's strategy to undermine Mark's efforts? He had suspected that Paul would go to great lengths to protect his empire. But he hadn't anticipated this level of manipulation. He glanced at Rachel, her face full of concern. "What do we do now?" she asked. Mark ran his hand through his hair, thinking quickly. They couldn't afford to back down now. The plan had already been set in motion. Even with this betrayal, they still had a chance to expose Paul for what he was. But things had become more complicated. They were no longer just fighting against Paul. They were fighting against a well-orchestrated machine designed to crush anyone who stood in their way. "Keep going," Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside. "We'll still go ahead with the press conference. We can't let them stop us now. We've come too far, but we need to be prepared. If Paul knows about this, He'll try to discredit us. He'll try to destroy the evidence. Rachel nodded, her expression resolute. I'll make sure the witnesses are ready. We'll go forward with the plan. But as Mark thought about what lay ahead, the pressure was undeniable. His once strong team was now fractured. C4's betrayal was a blow to their morale. But more than that, it was a reminder of just how far Paul was willing to go. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a mastermind, using every trick in the book to protect his empire. Mark knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. He would have to face Paul head-on. And it wouldn't just be about exposing the truth, it would be about outsmarting Paul. Staying one step ahead of him. The media, the witnesses, the documents, they were all tools in this battle. But Mark also had to rely on his own instincts and cunning to win. As he prepared for the press conference, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was just beginning. The stakes were higher than ever, and Paul was now more dangerous than ever. But Mark was determined. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The taste of betrayal lingered in Mark's mouth like ashes. Bitter and acrid, his most trusted ally had turned against him. And with it, his sense of security crumbled. But Mark wasn't the type to back down. He had come too far, seen too much to let this be the end. The loss of C4, a pivotal figure in his plan, stung, but it only fueled the fire within him. Now, the fight was no longer just about the company, it was personal. And Mark was going to bring the fight to Paul and his network. No matter the cost. In the wake of the betrayal, Mark knew he had to shift tactics. Going after Paul directly was no longer an option. Paul's people were too deeply embedded within the company. Too powerful. Mark needed a different approach. One that would expose the corruption on a much larger scale. He needed to make it impossible for Paul and his team to sweep everything under the rug. With that in mind, Mark reached out to a trusted source, an attorney named Alicia Green, who had built a reputation for taking on high-profile corruption cases. Alicia had a long history of fighting against corporate greed, and her track record made her the perfect ally for the uphill battle Mark was about to face. He briefed her on the situation, showing her the documents he had collected over the last few months. "This is bigger than you think," Alicia said after reviewing the materials. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the case. "If what you have here is true, Paul is in deep trouble. But so are you, Mark. Taking him on like this isn't going to be a clean fight. You're going to need more than just evidence. You're going to need the courts, the press, and the public on your side." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had already been fighting an invisible war for months. But now, the stakes were becoming tangible. It wasn't just his career on the line, it was the integrity of the entire company. And the lives of those who had been affected by Paul's greed. Mark had to see this through, even if it meant exposing his own vulnerabilities along the way. With Alicia on board, Mark began preparing for a courtroom battle. He and Alicia worked tirelessly, assembling a team of legal experts and strategists to ensure that they were ready for whatever Paul's team could throw at them. The documents, the testimonies from former employees, the financial records, all of it would be brought into the light. Mark knew the fight would be long and difficult, but this was the only way to make Paul face the consequences of his actions. The day of the trial arrived, and Mark walked into the courthouse with Alicia by his side. The air inside felt sterile, the weight of the legal system pressing down on him. The courtroom was filled with reporters, each eager to see how this high-stakes drama would unfold. But Mark's mind wasn't on the press or the spectators, his focus was squarely on the truth. Today, he would expose Paul's web of lies. As Mark sat down in the courtroom, he couldn't help but notice the sharp contrast between the tense, high-stakes atmosphere and the calm demeanor of Paul's legal team. Paul was seated in the back, his cold eyes scanning the room, confident as ever. It was as though he was playing a game, and Mark was merely a pawn in it. But just as Mark was about to take the stand, something unexpected happened. The key witness, Linda, one of the employees who had agreed to testify about the discriminatory practices, pulled out at the last minute. She had been shaking with fear when she entered the courtroom that morning. But now, she stood in the hallway, visibly distressed. "I can't do this," Linda said, her voice trembling as she spoke to Mark outside the courtroom. "I'm sorry, but I've been threatened. They told me if I testify, I'll lose everything. My job, my family. They're not just going after me. They're going after everyone I care about. Mark's heart sank. He had known there would be risks. But he hadn't expected this. The power that Paul wielded was much greater than he had realized. Paul had reached into every corner of the company. And now, he was using that power to intimidate the very people who could bring him down. Mark tried to reassure Linda, but the fear in her eyes told him it was too late. She was backing out, and with her, the key to unlocking Paul's deception. With Linda's withdrawal, the courtroom atmosphere shifted. Paul's team smiled, sensing victory, but Mark wasn't ready to give up. He looked to Alicia, who nodded, signaling that the fight wasn't over. We still have the evidence. Mark, she whispered, we can make this work. But as the trial continued, it became clear that Paul was using every weapon at his disposal to discredit Mark and his team. False narratives were spun in the media, and Paul's legal team worked tirelessly to confuse and mislead the jury. They made claims that Mark's investigation was based on incomplete information and biased witnesses. They twisted the truth, using their influence to paint Mark as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. Mark felt the pressure mounting. Every time he spoke, it seemed as though Paul's team was one step ahead, using their resources and connections to shift the narrative. Paul was playing the long game, and Mark was starting to realize just how difficult it would be to outmaneuver him. Despite the mounting challenges, Mark remained resolute. He knew the risks of continuing this battle, but he couldn't stop now. The stakes were too high. Every piece of evidence, every witness who came forward, had brought him one step closer to exposing the truth. And though the odds seemed stacked against him, Mark couldn't give in. He had to continue, not just for himself, but for the thousands of people whose lives had been affected by Paul's exploitation. Mark stood tall in the courtroom, his eyes focused on the task at hand. He had come too far to turn back. The fight was far from over, and even though the odds were growing more difficult by the day, Mark knew he had to keep pushing forward. For the truth, for justice. The days leading up to the final confrontation had been filled with mounting pressure and tension. Mark could feel it closing in, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had lost too much, too many allies, too many advantages, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He had spent months gathering evidence, tracking every lead, and making sacrifices. The truth was on his side, and he wasn't about to let Paul, or anyone else, silence it. Mark knew that the time had come for a final, decisive showdown. The courtroom battle was imminent, and this was his last chance to expose the full extent of the corruption that had been festering within the company. But there was something about this moment that felt different, something Mark couldn't shake. He had been so focused on the endgame, on bringing everything to light, that he hadn't prepared for the twists that could come from the shadows. He gathered what was left of his allies, the people who had stuck by him through thick and thin. Rachel was still there, her face lined with determination despite the exhaustion. Alicia, the lawyer who had become an indispensable part of his team, sat beside him, her sharp mind focused on the legal strategy ahead. Together, they had come up with a plan to bring the truth to the public, something that couldn't be ignored. Mark was going to expose Paul's web of deceit to the world. And they were going to do it on a grand scale. The plan was simple, yet bold. They would organize a live broadcast during the trial. The world would watch as Mark revealed the documents, the recordings, and the testimonies that could finally put an end to Paul's reign of corruption. It was a risky move, but one that Mark knew could turn the tide. If they could just show the public what Paul had been hiding, they would have no choice but to face the consequences. Mark was preparing himself for the moment when the truth would finally be out in the open. As the day of the trial approached, his team worked tirelessly to ensure everything was in place. They had the media lined up, the documents ready, and the key witnesses primed to speak. Mark couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief, knowing that they were finally going to take this fight to the public and shine a light on the corruption that had been festering for so long. But just as the final pieces were falling into place, the unthinkable happened. Mark's phone buzzed, and the message that popped up made his heart drop. It was from Michael, one of the last remaining allies in his team. Mark, we've got a problem. Someone's been leaking information to Paul. It's C6. We've been played. Mark's blood ran cold. C6. The insider who had been feeding them critical information had turned. Not only had they betrayed Mark's trust, but they had just handed over the very documents that could ruin everything. The moment Mark had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would be broadcast to the world, was now in jeopardy. He called Rachel immediately, his voice sharp with urgency. "Get to the broadcast station. We need to move up the timeline. Now, I don't care what we have to do. We can't let this leak stop us." But as the day went on, Mark's fear turned to frustration. Paul's legal team, with the fresh intel from C6, had already begun to move quickly. They'd begun to discredit Mark's entire case, spinning the narrative that he had tampered with evidence, that his team was filled with rogue elements working against the company. The media, once his ally, began to question his credibility. Mark knew that Paul was using this new information to turn the tide in his favor. But he refused to back down. Paul had played the game so many times before that he knew exactly what to do. He began to leak false stories, manipulate the press, and tarnish Mark's reputation. He was trying to frame Mark as a disgruntled employee, someone who was bitter and desperate for revenge. Mark could see the walls closing in, and the situation was becoming more dire by the minute. Mark couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal. He had been so sure of his plan, of the allies who had promised to stand by him. But now, with the key pieces of evidence compromised and the media spinning their own narrative, he was losing everything. The truth, it seemed, was being buried deeper with every passing second. And yet, in that moment of despair, Mark made a decision. He could give up, let the media and the public turn against him, or he could find a way to strike back in a way that Paul wouldn't see coming. Mark had already lost so much: his reputation, his allies, and the support of the people he thought he could trust. But he couldn't walk away now, not after everything he had been through. With his back against the wall, Mark took a deep breath. He knew he had to play the long game. The live broadcast could still work, but it needed to be a game changer. He couldn't just rely on the evidence anymore. He had to shift the narrative. He had to outsmart Paul, to turn the tables in a way that no one would expect. As he prepared for the final showdown, Mark couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The stakes were higher than ever, and with the deck stacked against him, he knew this would be his last chance to expose the truth. There was no turning back now. Mark stood in the shadow of defeat, but something inside him refused to let it consume him. After months of betrayal, manipulation, and mounting pressure, he had been pushed to the brink. Yet, he wasn't ready to quit. He had already lost so much: his allies, his reputation, his trust in the system, but he still had one thing left: the truth. And that truth would be his weapon, his shield, and his final chance to destroy Paul's empire of corruption. Desperation had fueled Mark's resolve, and now, with the noose tightening around his neck, he turned to the one thing that could bring him back into the fight: public exposure. He knew the system was rigged, that the law would only get him so far. But the court of public opinion was different. If he could get the media involved, if he could put the truth in front of the public eye, then maybe, just maybe, he could take Paul down. Mark reached out to trusted journalists, people who had been following the story from the outside, those who hadn't been bought or silenced by Paul's power. He also connected with legal authorities who had the muscle to take action, hoping to build a coalition strong enough to make waves. It wasn't just about winning in the courtroom anymore, it was about winning in the court of public perception, where the truth had the power to make Paul's lies crumble. The pressure was on. Mark was risking everything, and he knew it. If this failed, it would be the end. But if he succeeded, Paul's reign of power would be exposed for what it truly was: a house of cards ready to collapse. As the days ticked down to the public reveal, Mark could feel the tension in the air, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. The plan was simple. Mark and his allies would hold a press conference, not just for the press, but for the world. They would show the evidence, the documents, the tapes, the testimonies. The public had to see the truth, hear it, and know that Paul wasn't just a businessman. He was a master manipulator, a man who had built his empire on lies and exploitation. The day of the press conference arrived, and Mark stood before the cameras, his heart pounding in his chest. He was nervous, yes, but more than anything, He felt a quiet sense of power. The truth was finally going to be told. He took a deep breath, preparing himself to unveil the layers of deceit that had shackled so many people for so long. But just as the conference began, everything changed. A phone call came through to Mark's phone. One he wasn't expecting. It was Alicia, the lawyer, and her voice was tight with anxiety. "Mark, you need to listen to me. Something's gone wrong. One of our key witnesses, they're backing out." Mark's mind raced as Alicia's words sank in. The witness, someone who had been crucial to the case, was suddenly withdrawing. "What happened?" Mark demanded, his voice low, filled with frustration. "They've been threatened," Alicia explained, barely able to keep her composure. "Paul's people are pulling out all the stops. They've threatened to ruin her life, to destroy everything she's worked for." Mark felt a cold sweat run down his back. This was the moment he had feared. Despite all his careful planning, despite the work they had done to expose Paul, it was all unraveling in front of him. One final betrayal, one more twist, and everything was slipping away. Just as Mark was about to retreat, to try and salvage what little was left, something unexpected happened. A man in the back of the room, someone Mark didn't recognize, stood up. He was older, weathered, his face a mask of determination. The man walked toward the stage and handed Mark a folder. "This," the man said quietly, "this is what you need." Mark's heart skipped a beat as he opened the folder. Inside were more documents, new documents, ones that hadn't been part of their original investigation. These were the smoking guns, the missing pieces, and they were enough to turn the tide completely. The man, who introduced himself as an insider from within Paul's organization, had been working in secret, gathering information for months. He had known what was happening behind the scenes and, seeing the truth finally coming to light, he couldn't stay silent any longer. It was the twist Mark had been hoping for, the last piece of the puzzle that would finally bring down Paul. As Mark stood there, holding the new evidence in his hands, he felt a surge of adrenaline. Paul's empire, built on lies, was crumbling. The evidence in front of him was irrefutable. It was over. But Paul wasn't done yet. From the back of the room, Mark could see Paul's lawyers scrambling. The man who had once seemed so untouchable now seemed desperate, trying to regain control of the situation. He would use everything he had to stop the truth from coming out. He would use the media, his connections, and his vast resources to discredit Mark, to manipulate the narrative once again. Paul was not the type to go down without a fight, and Mark knew that Paul's final attempt would be his most dangerous. Yet, despite the weight of the odds against him, Mark stood tall. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. As he watched the press coverage shift in real time, the narrative slowly shifting in his favor, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Paul, no matter how powerful, could no longer control the truth. It was finally being exposed, for everyone to see. The people Paul had exploited, the ones whose lives had been manipulated for years, now had a voice, and with that voice came the strength to tear down the empire Paul had spent so long building. The battle was over, but the war for justice was far from done. Mark knew this was just the beginning. But for now, it was enough. Mark had always known that victory didn't come without sacrifice. After months of heart-wrenching struggles and moral dilemmas, after losing allies and gaining enemies, the moment of triumph had finally come. Paul was behind bars, his empire crumbled, and the company he had twisted into his personal playground was slowly being restored. For the first time in what felt like years, Mark allowed himself a fleeting moment of relief. The battle had been long, but he had won. Yet, as Mark stood in the center of the now quiet office, he realized something that made his chest tighten. The truth, as liberating as it had been, wasn't completely accepted. There were still whispers among the employees, unsure if Mark had done the right thing, questioning the decisions he'd made throughout the investigation. Despite the victory, the air in the office felt thick with distrust. The walls of the boardroom still echoed with the tension of the past few weeks. Mark could sense the unease in the faces of the employees as they looked at him. Some with gratitude, others with suspicion. The shareholders were still skeptical, wondering if the company could truly recover after everything that had happened. Mark had played his part in exposing the truth, but now, he was facing the aftermath, both professionally and personally. He had expected some of this. Rebuilding trust, after all, would take time, but what he hadn't anticipated was just how much the scars of this battle would linger. He walked through the hallways, nodding to those who gave him hesitant smiles, trying to find a sense of normalcy again. The company's future was uncertain, but at least the chains had been broken. At least Paul was no longer in control. But just as Mark was starting to think about what life might look like after the dust settled, something unexpected came to light. It was a small piece of information at first, just a whisper from one of his colleagues, but it grew into something much bigger. There were rumors of another hidden plot, something even darker than before. Mark had assumed that once Paul was removed from the picture, the system would right itself, that the company would begin to heal. But this new piece of information painted a different picture. The betrayal had been far deeper than he realized. The whispers revealed that Paul's network had been more embedded than anyone had thought. His followers had planned, carefully and systematically, to maintain their control over the company even after Paul's downfall. Their actions had been so well hidden that even Mark's best efforts to dismantle the organization hadn't been enough to root out the entirety of their influence. The truth hit Mark hard. His victory had felt complete, until now. It wasn't just the company that had been manipulated, it was the entire structure of power. Paul had set up a network that could continue operating in the shadows. One that could continue pulling strings, even without his physical presence. This new development brought with it a surge of frustration. Mark thought he had defeated Paul's system, but he hadn't even touched the surface of the real problem. As Mark sat in his office, staring at the new information in front of him, his thoughts began to swirl. His victory, once so sweet, now tasted like ash. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. What he had exposed was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it was a system that still thrived in the shadows. A system that was still operating and planning its next move. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He could walk away, try to put this all behind him, and begin the long road of healing. Both for himself and the company. He had earned the right to step away and find peace. But Mark knew, deep down, that he could never let this go. He had come too far. The fight for truth and justice wasn't over. Not until every last thread of Paul's influence was unraveled. Mark stood up and walked over to the window, looking out over the city. The skyline was beautiful, but it felt hollow. It was a stark reminder of the world he lived in. A world where corruption could thrive in silence. Where shadows could shape the future without anyone noticing until it was too late. Mark's phone buzzed with messages. And he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't let this rest. There were still secrets, still lies, still enemies lurking in the dark. He had come too far to quit now. Paul had been arrested, but his network was still in place. Mark realized that the war he had started wasn't about to end. He wasn't just fighting for his career or the company anymore. This had become a fight for the very soul of the system that Paul had manipulated. It was a fight for justice. Not just for the company, but for the people who had suffered because of Paul's actions. The decision weighed heavily on Mark's mind. He could take a step back, start over, and rebuild his life. Or he could plunge deeper into the darkness, uncovering every last secret, every last corner of Paul's web. The first option offered peace, but the second offered closure, real closure. He knew what he had to do. Mark took a deep breath and made his decision. The fight was far from over, and it was time to go after the last pieces of Paul's legacy. There was still too much at stake to walk away. The dust had settled. Paul was behind bars. The company was slowly recovering, and Mark could finally take a breath. The victory was hard won. And yet, in the silence of that moment, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. The battle against Paul had been brutal, but Mark had been fighting for more than just a personal vendetta. The system, the very structure that had allowed Paul to thrive, was still intact. It wasn't enough to remove one man from power. The roots of corruption ran much deeper than he had anticipated. It had been weeks since the trial, but Mark couldn't stop thinking about the larger implications of everything that had happened. While he had won his personal war, the organization he now led was still fraught with issues that had to be addressed for real change to take hold. Paul may have been defeated, but the system that enabled him still lingered in the walls, in the policies, in the practices of the company. Mark made a decision that would shape the next chapter of his life. It wasn't enough to simply replace one corrupt leader with another. He needed to rebuild, to create something that wouldn't just serve the interests of a few powerful individuals, but rather serve everyone within the company. He needed to lead by example, to show that change wasn't just about winning battles, it was about creating a system where fairness and justice were the foundation. Mark began a large-scale reform of the company, starting with its internal processes. He worked closely with his advisors and legal experts, re-evaluating the policies that had allowed corruption to thrive. Everything had to change, from how decisions were made to how employees were treated. It wasn't just about implementing new policies, it was about creating a culture that valued ethics, transparency, and respect. He knew that it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to make it happen. One of the first steps was to implement new policies regarding ethics and fairness in hiring, promotions, and pay. These policies were not just paperwork, they were promises. They were a commitment to every employee that things were going to be different. Mark set up anonymous reporting systems for employees to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. He created a new board of advisors, one that would help him hold the company accountable and ensure that these changes were being carried out properly. But just as Mark began to feel the weight of these changes taking shape, something unexpected happened. A new investigation was launched. It seemed like the ghosts of the past refused to stay buried. A new set of issues had surfaced, ones that had been hidden even deeper within the company's operations. Despite all the reforms Mark had initiated, it was clear that there were still areas that had been untouched. Areas where Paul's influence had continued to linger. The investigation wasn't a surprise to Mark. He had known that the work was far from over. But the fact that these issues had been hidden for so long, that they could resurface so suddenly, was a bitter pill to swallow. It was a stark reminder that the fight against corruption wasn't a one-time battle. It was ongoing. Mark realized that he had only scratched the surface of the changes that needed to happen. And this was just another obstacle in the long road ahead. Despite the setback, Mark didn't falter. He couldn't afford to. He had made a promise to his employees, to the company, and to himself. The changes he had started would continue, and he would be the one to lead the charge. The fight for justice wasn't just about taking down one man, it was about creating a system that would stand the test of time. Mark couldn't stop now. He wouldn't stop. As the new investigation unfolded, Mark found himself once again immersed in a battle he hadn't fully expected. But this time, it was different. He wasn't fighting for revenge, and he wasn't fighting alone. He had built a team of people who shared his vision of a fairer, more transparent organization, and together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the midst of these new challenges, Mark had a moment of clarity. The fight for justice, the fight for change, was never going to be easy. It wasn't going to have a neat, happy ending. There would always be obstacles. Always be those who tried to hold onto power. Always be new battles to fight. But that didn't mean the fight wasn't worth it. The lessons Mark had learned along the way had only strengthened his resolve. This was about more than just a company. It was about something much bigger. It was about making a difference. About proving that one person could make a change, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Mark knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for it. The fight for justice wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And Mark, for the first time in a long time, felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The story wasn't finished, but it was far from over. As we've seen in today's story, sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, and it takes courage to uncover what lies beneath. Mark's journey wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about confronting a system that had been broken for far too long. The lessons here are clear. Standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, can lead to profound change. But the fight doesn't end with one victory. It's a continuous effort to keep pushing for fairness and justice, no matter the obstacles. What do you think? Have you ever had to confront an uncomfortable truth in your own life? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to follow us for more thought-provoking stories. Thank you for watching Undercover Truths.